Good morning, everybody. So there's about 6 people awake in the audience. One more time. Good morning, everyone. There we go. There's some Opportunity Zones energy. Well, it's exciting to be here today and with a lot of friends and fellow travelers in the Opportunity Zone world. I want to start today by providing a little context of how we got to where we are in the Opportunity Zones program and a little bit of what we're seeing in terms of the impact in the political space, in communities, in the marketplace. So let me give 2 quick seconds of context. Opportunity Zones were really created in the backdrop of a US economy that had been growing pretty rapidly over the course of 2013 to 2017, but where that growth was reaching in a historically small part of the country. And we thought at the Economic Innovation Group, which is the group I co-founded with Sean Parker and John Lettieri, who was on stage yesterday, that was a problem, that problem of geographic inequality, that was more important than the conversation we were having in the country around income inequality, because it meant that in America, your destiny, your chance to achieve the American dream was really defined by your zip code. And Opportunity Zones were the first new attempt at solving that problem, and in a brand new way that had been created by Congress in about 20 years or so. So it started with a bipartisan group of economists, Jared Bernstein, who was Vice President Biden's chief economist, obviously now a candidate for president, and Kevin Hassett, who's now Donald Trump's chief economist. And it was supported by about 100 members of Congress across the political aisle, led by Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, who I'm sure Mayor Benjamin knows quite well, and Cory Booker, a Democrat from New Jersey, now also running for president. And so it was really built with this bipartisan ethos in place. And it also had some pretty important private sector stakeholders that were pushing forward. And I want to start with a question for you, Steve Case and Jim Sorenson. You guys have both had a lot of success as venture capitalists, as philanthropists, in impact investing. What ultimately led you in the years before this program even became legislation, became a reality, to want to get involved in this in this advocacy process around Opportunity Zones? So let me start with you, Steve.
Sure. The driver for me over really the last decade is how do you level the playing field and really create opportunity for all? How do you make sure, as Secretary Carson just said, this really is a land of opportunity for all? And that helped inform some of our work around Rise the Rest. How do you get more venture capital to more people in more places? And I worked on the Jobs Act that passed 6 or 7 years ago, jump-starting our Business Startups Act to create an on-ramp for younger companies to go public and also allow crowdfunding to be used as a way to raise capital for companies, which seemed like a good way to get the capital in the hands of more entrepreneurs, particularly more entrepreneurs that weren't in the usual places or part of the usual investor networks. And then when the Investing in Opportunity Act started getting some traction 3 or 4 years ago, I became an evangelist for it, an advocate for it, because it was another way to make, trying to change the dynamics and get more capital flowing to different parts of the country that for many years have been left behind. And the nice thing, Steve, as you said, both the Jobs Act and the Investing in Opportunity Act that then became the Opportunity Zone component of tax reform, both have the benefit of having broad bipartisan support. There's a lot of things that divide us as a country. There are a lot of things that create animosity, unfortunately, in Washington, D.C. But when you talk about innovation, entrepreneurship, jobs, economic opportunity, that is an issue that does bring people together. There is broad bipartisan support for the Jobs Act. There is broad bipartisan support for the Investing in Opportunity Act. So that's why I was such a big advocate of it.
I want to go to Jim in a second, but you were just in Puerto Rico, right, as part of your Rise of the Rest tour just last week. Puerto Rico is unique in this universe of Opportunity Zones because the whole island qualifies as an Opportunity Zone. Jim and I were talking earlier about how this was a critical piece. The whole Opportunity Zones package being passed at all was to ensure this would be part of the recovery and disaster relief tool in Puerto Rico. What do you see out there that sort of maybe connected some of the dots between what this program was designed to do in terms of creating all of these different types of investments and a place that clearly is at, a low point in its economy, maybe historically?
No, Puerto Rico is been whacked first by some changes, legislative changes that eliminated some of the incentives around pharmaceutical manufacturing, lost a lot of jobs, then got whacked by Zika, which hurt tourism, and then obviously got whacked by a hurricane a couple years ago. But it's rebuilding, and it's trying to shift to be an island of opportunity. And the fact that it is essentially the entire island is an opportunity zone, I think, is getting folks who might not have been paying attention to it to start paying attention to it. And we were very excited by what we saw there. There's about 3.5 million people there. There's a lot of entrepreneurial enthusiasm there. There has been, like in many parts of the country, a brain drain. A lot of people left there because there wasn't an opportunity there, so they went to other places. But now people are starting to come back. Fewer people are leaving. And I think it is a great example of a great place to watch in terms of the opportunity zone legislation. The tax incentives related to that could very well help launch this next wave of innovation there. So we're very encouraged.
So, Jim, you're maybe the most well-known impact investor in the country. You have a center at the University of Utah. You're, I think, one of the great philanthropists in America. And yet, those sectors, impact investing and philanthropy, have been a little bit schizophrenic when it comes to opportunity zones. What are you seeing from your perch? Because I know you're also excited about it. I know you're also sensitive to some of the concerns out there in those communities. How should we understand the program coming from that perspective?
Yeah, I think it was really the potential for opportunity zones and that legislation to motivate more traditionally oriented investors to become impact investors that really attracted me in the first place.
So we're kind of tricking them into it.
Yeah, I felt like the federal government really needed to get involved, state government really needed to get involved in promoting policy that motivated impact investing. And as I was kind of working on the Hill on other legislation, the CIPRA legislation, which was also passed, I became aware of the great work that had been done there at EIG, and I loved the connection really to impact investing. And at that point in time, really devoted my time and energy and whatever resources I could to help in getting the passage. And I see this, I think, probably from a little more of an optimistic point of view than I think some in the philanthropic community. I think that there is potential for, I would say, motivations that generate some gentrification, and that's been the biggest issue that you hear about. But I think there's much greater problems as it relates to those that are in concentrated areas of poverty that Secretary Carson mentioned. The economic activity is going to lift the whole boat, and I believe that this legislation, because of the flexibility, because of the market and the very broad nature of it, really has tremendous potential for impact throughout the country.
Mayor Benjamin, we heard from Secretary Carson earlier today, and he was describing opportunity zones from this administration's perspective and the energy and efforts they're putting around making this a larger program around the country. You're sort of almost sitting at the other end of that spectrum. You're a Democratic mayor, and not just the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, but the president of the Conference of Mayors. You were an early voice on this as well. How do you see this program within the context of what the tools mayors need to address problems they're facing? And honestly, to Jim's point, I hear too when I travel around the country concerns about gentrification. But when I talk to most mayors and I look at most of the statistics, it seems to impact a very small part of the country where most of the country is really looking for more investment, not worrying about too much investment. So give us a little sense of where you see it as a Democrat, as a mayor, and really as a leader of mayors around the country.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. I was an early supporter of the Investing in Opportunity Act, primarily because every time I went to see my Senator Tim Scott, we'd come to talk about infrastructure or protecting the tax exemption of municipal bonds, whatever it happened to be, and he'd always say, have we talked about my Investing in Opportunity Act? I mean, it was really because of the work that you and and John and Sean Parker and so many others did laying the foundation for not only a bipartisan but also a bicameral approach. Pat Tiberi and Ron Kind in the House as well. There was some real traction in an environment where D.C. can at times be incredibly fractured. To see this type of bipartisan support that supported the ideas that I've always felt were strong. If we could find ways to have private sector capital help us meet public sector needs, help us live within the values of the cities that we represent. I represent Columbia, South Carolina, and I've had the pleasure this year of serving as president of the United States Conference of Mayors. For those of you who may not have ever been to Columbia, it's a state capital, first planned state capital in the country. We're home to Carnegie Research One University, the home of the fighting Gamecocks. We fight every once in a while, not every year. We're home to Fort Jackson. Victory starts at Fort Jackson. We train a majority of the men and women for the U.S. Army. We have a philosophy there where we work hard just to create an environment where private sector capital feels welcome, we treat it well, and it grows. We start by modeling the type of fiscal behavior that we ought to have. We have not had a tax increase in Columbia in a decade. We've actually cut our tax millage. We've finished 6 of the last 8 years with a budget surplus. We've gotten 3 upgrades from Standard & Poor's and Moody's. We've increased our police department funding by 60%. We've made a $500 million investment in infrastructure, including first tranche this past December in green infrastructure, our first green bonds, with another $500 million to come, making the smart investments that make a city grow. And I say that because our city is not atypical, and we've been trying to find greater partnership and great incentives working with Washington, D.C. to try and attract more capital into our cities, recognizing that as go America's cities, so goes America. 85.5% of our citizens now live in cities and metro economies. 89% of all jobs are cities and metro economies. 92% of America's GDP is created in cities and metro economies. New York City, the largest city in our country, has a larger GDP than the entire country of Russia. So if, in fact, we have more tools available at our disposal to try and make sure our cities are still growing and becoming more and more prosperous, and making sure that we focus on equitable development across our cities, and we find ways, interesting ways, and attractive ways to attract more private sector capital in some areas where that have been historically neglected, then we can have a win-win all around. It's important to know that obviously we're not talking about charity, we're talking about good deals. And I want to encourage everyone, we've got to make sure that we invest heavily in good, solid deals that reflect the values of our communities and live within the spirit of what the Investing and Opportunity Act was meant to be. Because I worry about the fickleness of Washington, D.C. If in fact we don't show that across these 8,700 census tracts, we won't see success everywhere, but we need to see them in urban communities, in suburban communities, and rural communities. If we show some success, this will inure, I believe, significantly to the benefit of all Americans.
Let me dig into that a little bit more. If you follow at least some of the press around opportunity zones, the press sort of reads as if there's a lot of controversy around this program when you get to communities. And you're talking to mayors more than anyone else on this stage. How much controversy do you feel around this program among your mayors in your conference? What issues are coming up? What are things we should be thinking about or aware of that they want in terms of partnerships with private sector funds and private sector investors that maybe they're not seeing?
Sure. Mayors are a fairly heterogeneous group. I mean, we represent every city, 30,000 people and larger across the country. But you'll find some incredible innovators from the work Eric Garcetti is doing in LA down to Erie, Pennsylvania, or Birmingham, Alabama, or Louisville, Kentucky. People on both sides of the aisle really just trying, and I will tell you, the folks who are thoughtful and innovative and thinking about ways, like the Secretary mentioned, to remove some regulatory schemes that have been in place for 50, 60 years for a different generation. To try and incentivize bringing that capital into their communities to help meet, and there's so many different things, from housing, as Secretary Carson mentioned, to what are we doing together to address America's $4 trillion infrastructure deficit? How are we working together to attract some other patient capital into the bloodstream to deal with some of our resilience issues and dealing with some of these wet weather events and climate change events? The innovative mayors who are thinking about meeting these long-term needs in a way that inures to the benefit of their citizens long-term are speaking up resoundingly in support of opportunity zones.
Rony, I want to get you in the conversation here and maybe transition from some of the context of where the program was kind of designed to be to where we are now. And this is an interesting time to be talking about opportunity zones because the Treasury Department has just finished putting out the second set of what are now 250 pages of rules around opportunity zones. I'm sure you've read every last word of it. I have it memorized by this point. We have this map now that has 8,700 zones around the country. You've got, I don't know, by some counts, 300 funds that have launched. Give us a little bit of a snapshot of where the market is now. Are we going to see more funds launch this year? Are we going to see it across other asset classes? Are we going to see more geographies in just a handful of these gateway cities you may read about in New York and California? What should we expect over the course of 2019?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that everyone has been doing in the last few months since the opportunity zones came up was to invest in real estate. The rules are really a lot more clear, or used to be a lot more clear, as it has to do with investment in real estate. Then, as we all know, there's also investment in businesses that are located within the opportunity zone. But there were not a lot of clarification among those rules. The new regulations, what they have done, they have actually given a lot more clarity as it relates to investing in businesses. So there is a lot more guidance there. So we're expecting to see a higher pickup of venture capitalists that want to go into those areas to actually do business investments. We will still continue to see a lot of real estate investment because the new regulations also gave a lot more clarity as it relates to real estate investments, but there's definitely a lot of clarity, as I said before, related to business. A lot of the requirements that are there, in the past, there's this concept of you have to invest in a trader business, and that trader business has to generate 50% or more of its gross receipts within the opportunity zone. A lot of the times when you have a startup, you don't have gross receipts early in the stage. And I think one of the goals of this program is to get startups to go to these opportunity zones. So now the new regulations have also given us a handful of other requirements that you may need absent the 50% of gross receipts. You may have 50% of your wages, 50% of your services within the zone. So it's a lot more taxpayer friendly and a lot more clearer now what you can do as it relates to investing in business. As I mentioned before, the opportunity zone regulations, for the most part, have been very taxpayer friendly. Just to touch a couple items as it relates to going back to real estate. Everyone kept wondering, like, what happens with debt finance distributions? When you do a refi and the property that you have in an opportunity zone, if you distribute that money to your investor may not have any actually shouldn't have any tax basis because they put tax-free capital in there. Now they get a distribution. What the IRS has come out and said is that as long as they get a debt allocation, which they should get according to the internal tax regulations, equal to the distribution, there is no gain transaction for them. So that's actually pretty good news for people that want to do debt finance distributions. Just got to be careful with those. A couple other things. One of them that's not very, I guess you can say not very taxpayer friendly, is as it relates to 1231 gains. As we all know, opportunity zone money usually has to come from capital gains, which in the real estate world, most of it is 1231 gain. What the IRS is saying is that an investor has to net its gains and losses for the year before they can determine the amount that they can defer and invest in an opportunity zone.
And 1231 gains are typically the gains you get out of real estate sales.
Correct. When you're out of real estate, 1231 gains.
Compared to like a stock market sale, which has a different.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the key thing to remember is if you have a stock market sale, your 180-day clock starts when you sell that asset and you have realized the gain. If you have a 1231 gain, because of these rules that you have to net different investments, and you may not know this information until the end of the year, the IRS says that your clock starts on 1231 at the year end. So a lot of people like that rule because now they have 6 months after year end to invest their 1231 gain.
Well, I want to make a public service announcement on that. There are going to be a group of people, maybe even in this room, who sold a piece of real estate last February and thought that their clock expired to reinvest their gains. And because of these new rules, you have until essentially late June to reinvest that gains from that 2018 sale. So if you wanted to look into the opportunities in the market and you just didn't because of that clock, you sort of have a new window to do that. I want to talk a little bit about this question of asset classes. I want to go to you, Steve. This is really the only program in the tax code where you're incentivized to go from real estate to business investment. Obviously, you have 1031s now if you wanted to roll over into real estate, and you can use the program for that as well, but there's nothing that gets you to the business side. And I think to Ronnie's point, and I think what the administration did a good job of, is keeping this program as closely following as possible to the way business actually gets done, the way real estate investors invest, and also the way business investors invest. But most of the organization and the fund creation has really been around real estate. You're obviously a venture capitalist. This is an incentive that rewards growth investment because you get to forgive that, could be 100-time capital gains. How useful do you think it's going to be in venture capital and in the communities that you're focused on, which are a lot of these same communities?
I think it will be increasingly useful. I've been having this debate over last year with Secretary Mnuchin. A year ago, I said I thought 80% of the money and opportunity zone money would go to real estate, 20% in the company. He thought it would be 80% in the companies, 20% in the real estate. The recent rules that came out do help on the business side, so I think it'll be a little higher, but I still expect the majority to go into real estate. But it is important, as the mayor said, that we keep our eye on the ball. The reason the Congress passed this with such broad bipartisan support is it would help lift up communities by investing in neighborhoods that need that investment and creating jobs. And real estate in and of itself doesn't create the jobs. It's the companies that move into that real estate that will create the jobs. And so the way it's playing out now, and obviously it's only passed 18 months ago, and the final rules just came out, and so people are trying to react to it, is some are focused just on the venture capital side, investing in companies, some with broader funds that are investing everywhere but are looking for specific opportunity zone opportunities. Some are creating opportunity zone specific venture funds. Some are creating real estate funds focused just on opportunity zones. We actually decided to do that with Rise the Rest, so we have a team kind of working on that. And then some are creating hybrid funds that invest in particular cities, and the capital is essentially commingled to invest in companies and in real estate. Time will tell which strategy will play out and be the most successful. Our own bias is, while we want to invest in both the company side and in the real estate side, we do think the skill set is different, and so we've set it up as separate teams. The main point, though, is for people to realize it is a big opportunity to figure out some of the cities to target of the 8700 zone, which are the ones that make the most sense, and be careful to make sure you're investing in great projects, particularly on the real estate side, because there were a lot of bad projects that suddenly were repositioned as opportunity zone projects, and it will not make a bad project good, it will make a good project better. So now the focus, there is more interest, there is more capital kind of moving off the sidelines into the space, but people are going to need to make sure they're backing good projects or good sponsors, good funds that have the right expertise to pick the right projects. That, I think, is what's going to happen over the next year. In the long run, I do believe it will be helpful both on the real estate side and on the company side. And coincidentally, I think you were on one of these tours 4 years ago when we were doing Rise the Rest. In every city we visited, and now it's been 43 cities, we've seen opportunities in neighborhoods to invest in those neighborhoods. I remember in Cincinnati, there was an area called Over the Rhine, OTR, that had been one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country, and had been revitalized because the startups moved in. 50 years ago, if you want to revitalize a neighborhood, you get the artists to move in, like Soho in New York. Now the shift was to get the entrepreneurs to move in. And I kept telling real estate folks, you should create real estate investment funds to focus on these rising cities. The opportunity zone legislation, I think, has fired that bell, and there will be a lot more capital flowing into it. And it is synergistic because you're building out these neighborhoods, you're building mixed use, you're building co-working space that is helpful startup infrastructure that will help on the company side, even if it's viewed through the prism of essentially a real estate investment. So they're very synergistic.
Well, I want to get on that, talk to that point of this being a kind of a big market and the geographies where we may see it. If you listen to Manny Friedman yesterday talk about opportunity zones, he thinks this is a $1 trillion opportunity. And I often say a similar thing. I think there's, based on the flow that you're already seeing happening in opportunity zones, you're talking about maybe $100 billion a year in this market. That's obviously bigger than New York City and Oakland and LA and some of the early movers in this marketplace. It's going to have to find assets in other part of the country. It's going to have to find it across different asset classes, and it can move that kind of money. It becomes like almost like a modern day Marshall Plan, right? Like crowdfunding the kind of scale of what we did in Europe after World War II. And a lot of these communities, if you spend time there, some parts of them feel like that. They feel war-torn almost. So Jim, I want to go to you. You're someone who's crossed different asset classes. You're a real estate investor, you're a venture capitalist and a technologist. You've also had a geographic focus, I think that's largely been in the middle of the country. what should fund managers, as they're thinking about this, be looking for when they're thinking about what makes a good opportunity zone? And how should funds be structuring what they do, as in the real estate or other contexts, so that it has the kind of impact that will preserve the intent of the program, but also reflects the desire of a lot of the investors who you're talking to?
Yeah. We're raising a fund right now, and these are key questions. And we see, I think, real opportunities.
Will it be bigger than the Skybridge Fund?
What's that?
Will it be bigger than the Skybridge Fund? $3 billion, I think.
I don't know if it's bigger than the Skybridge Fund, but I think to answer your question, we really believe in the thesis that there's opportunity in areas of the country that have been overlooked. And sometimes that can be just in not having so many players that are after chasing those deals. But I think many times there are basically latent demand drivers that these are things that we look for in the investments that we'll be making. I think community engagement is clearly right at the top of the list, and I think the mayor is really a great example. I think we look for those opportunities or investments that have strong community engagement and collaboration in the community with the stakeholders that have a strategic vision. Other important factors to us are really demand or latent demand factors, such as proximity to transportation corridors or universities, or an underutilized but potential workforce that can be retrained and skilled for the opportunities that may arise on the business scene. We look for strong leadership within the communities and well-run communities, and those really exist all across the country. And so much of the attention right now is focused on the coasts. I read an article recently, and it had the top 50 opportunity zones, and 41 of them were on the coasts and kind of where all the money has gone. And there were only 9 that were in the flyover states. I think these represent really excellent opportunities, and I think you're going to see really thoughtful developers as well as funds that really take advantage of these types of situations. And I think that it's important that as the funds are working with these communities, that they're very collaborative and working together. And I think it is that collaboration that creates ultimately the sustainable value that will generate successful returns, both from an impact and financial.
Mayor Benjamin, I want to turn part of that question to you too. Jim mentioned the importance of local leadership stepping up here. This is, in one major way this is different than all previous community development programs, is there's no upfront government dollars coming to these zones. There's no guarantees in this program. You have to be able to attract the market, and the impact market's going to be a part of it, but frankly most of the market's going to be market rate investors that are looking for deals that pencil out to the returns that their investors respect or expect, whether it's in real estate or other stuff. So how do you think about that? I mean, how should mayors, how are the successful places, how are the leaders of successful places going to be structuring what they do at the city level or at the state level to attract this form of capital when they're competing against 8,700 places across the country?
Sure. Well, historically, cities have had, of course, it changes every other city you go to, but limited tools to deal with to try and incentivize private sector capital coming in. Most of them have actually come through HUD, Community Development Block Grant funding, home funding, and others. Other than that, it's had to come from our general funds, which, depending on the city, can be either strong or not. Smart cities, if in fact, and I want to encourage each and every one of you, if you need one takeaway, to go home and talk to your mayor or other elected officials, find out what the most pressing issues or pressing project that city is trying to deliver on, has been trying to deliver on for some time. I do think this presents a real opportunity for some serious P3s, some great public-private partnerships. And if you want to throw in philanthropy, maybe P4s as well. To structure deals and come up with some creative capital stacks that help deliver on some projects that allow local officials to live up to campaign promises, to help them deliver on some projects that are very important. It's important to me in my city, not just to deal with affordable housing issues, but really to try and deliver some more workforce housing. How do we create a city that the people who work in the city can actually live in the city? How do you attract more police officers and teachers and nurses and have them actually living in the city that they make so special to live in? So I do believe that we've got to start with more dialogue. The same bipartisan spirit that led to the Investing in Opportunity Act, that attracted people like Steve Case and others to want to make it law. We've got to make sure we continue the dialogue, and it will allow us to attract more capital to help meet our respective needs in our cities. But every city is going to be different. Again, some cities will have major resilience issues, some will have housing issues, some will have some serious commercial revitalization issues in certain parts of town. If in fact it's something that aligns with my priorities, our council priorities, and something the city's been trying to do, then the ability to find additional funds to meet maybe public infrastructure needs surrounding a project, or make that parking garage happen, that makes your deal pro forma, believe me, it gets the innovative juices flowing if we start with some dialogue that helps make everyone succeed.
But the other thing, Steve, I think it's super important. I do hear this debate, heard it yesterday around how big is this? Is it $1 trillion, $100 billion? So I think that discussion is premature and probably a waste of time. The reality is investors will start making investments. If it's working, they'll make more investments. If it's not working, they will pull back. It's just like venture capital. The top funds do really well. A lot of funds don't do well. Just because venture capital tends to outperform other asset classes doesn't mean all the money pours in there, because it's limited by the companies to back and limited by the top funds to support. So there's a lot of interest now. People will start putting at least their toe in the water if they're generating the returns that they are hoping for, expecting. Obviously, it'll allocate more capital to it, and it will accelerate. At the same time, it goes back to what the mayor and others said, if we don't get this right in terms of the impact on the communities, we're not actually lifting up those communities, we actually aren't creating opportunity in those communities, we're not creating jobs in those communities, this will get unwound. There will be pressures to pull back on it. Right now, it's an amazing opportunity. I'm delighted that Anthony and the team here has decided to make it a major focus of this conference. Investors should look at it, both on the real estate side and the company side, but we have to get it right. It has to generate great investment returns while having a positive impact on the community. I believe it will, but only if we are really focused and intentional about that.
So let me add on a kind of bridge to that question, and we can kind of end on that. So maybe a speed round here, 30 seconds. If we're back here at SALT, and they're probably not going to invite me back. They might invite you guys back. 5 years from now, when we're looking back at this program, how will we know it was successful? What does success mean to you for this program? What should we be looking for 5 years from now in terms of what we're seeing from investors, what we're seeing in terms of communities, and how we're seeing this marketplace develop? So, Ronnie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, from an income tax perspective, I mean, we hope to see a lot of funds that are going to be invested in these communities. There will not be a lot of information as far as gains, because you have to wait 10 years to sell your assets and to do all these other things. But we expect to see a lot of activity happening. And then, like Steve said, if there is an improvement in the communities and that there has been something other than just making profit for the investor, but the communities have benefited, that'll be a good way to check this.
And this obviously ties to one of the holes that I know you've been working on, Jim, which is this reporting mechanism and the data collection mechanism that was in this bill got stripped out in the congressional process because of procedural reasons, and now there's a lot of hustle and bustle in the impact community to kind of add that back in. What do we have to do to get to that phase where we can evaluate it?
Yeah, well, I think it's really a very important, really almost vital aspect to the program. Number one, I think it helps to keep the program feet to the fire in terms of measuring the impact, reporting the impact, and it really creates then a real justification for renewal. I think the latest regs have called for a request for information the IRS has on what those reporting metrics should be. And I know there are a number of organizations that have put up their suggested reporting requirements. The U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, for example, has worked with a number of stakeholders and have a fairly comprehensive set of metrics to be measured. But in the end, I think it really, this program will be successful, will be renewed, if it delivers on its original premise.
And there's new legislation by Scott and Booker and others to add those reporting mechanisms. And I know we're out of time. I'll just add both Steves, 10 seconds each. What should we be looking for 5 years from now?
In God we trust, everyone else bring me data. I think we pay attention to the data, see how we've improved the lives of people who live in those census tracts, and that's going to be the driver. In addition to data, never underestimate the power of public narrative. We've got to make sure we chronicle the successes here and be able to communicate it to a public that's hungry for good stories.
As investors, if we keep the bar high and are backing the best project that have the best potential for return and the best potential for impact in those communities, people will celebrate this, more capital will be flowing to it, and maybe it even gets extended. If that's not the case, if the projects don't work out, obviously investors will pull back, and if it's not helpful to the communities, this program will not last too long. So let's figure out a way to make it work, because it is a way, going back to our earlier discussion, to get more capital to more people in more places, create a more inclusive innovation economy while generating great returns for investors.
Steve Case, Steve Benjamin, Jim Sorenson, Rodney Rodriguez, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Good deal.